August 1978. The wheat was ready, 300 acres of golden grain, heads heavy and dry, waiting for the blade. And standing in Carl Metcalf's machine shed was the combine that was supposed to cut it. A 1962 John Deere 55, 16 years old, showing every one of those years in faded paint and worn metal. Carl was 41 that summer, farming land his father had bought in 1945 outside of Concordia, Kansas. The combine had been his father's, purchased used in 1968, and it had cut every wheat harvest since. Pulled type, powered by a 20-foot header, it could process about 12 acres on a good day if everything went right. Which lately, it didn't always. The bearing in the cylinder had been making noise. The canvas on the feeder house was starting to fray. The engine smoked a little on startup. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that stopped the machine from working, but enough that people noticed. Enough that they talked. And enough that Ron Hartley, the John Deere dealer from Concordia, decided to pay Carl a visit. Ron pulled up on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days before harvest was set to start, driving a new pickup with dealer plates. He climbed out wearing clean jeans and a JD cap, smiled that salesman's smile, and walked over to where Carl was greasing the combine. "Carl, got a minute?" "Sure, Ron. What brings you out?" Ron looked at the old 55, at the patches of primer showing through faded green paint, at the worn tires and the jury-rigged repairs that kept it running. "Came to talk about your harvest situation." "What about it?" "Well," Ron gestured at the combine, "you're planning to cut 300 acres with that." "Same as I did last year." "Carl, that machine's 16 years old. It's living on borrowed time. One breakdown during harvest could cost you your entire crop. It's held up fine so far." So far being the key words. Ron pulled out a brochure from his truck. "I've got a 1975 John Deere 7700 sitting on my lot right now. 3 years old, low hours, barely broken in, pull type like you're used to, but with a 24-foot header. You could cut your harvest time in half." Carl kept greasing the combine. "What's it cost?" $32,000, but I can get you financed at 9% over 5 years. Payments would run about $680 a month. Carl did the math in his head. $8,000 a year in combine payments. His entire wheat crop in a good year brought in maybe $18,000 gross. After input costs and operating expenses, he netted around $8,000 to $10,000. "Can't afford it, Ron. Can't afford not to, is more like it. That old 55 breaks down in the middle of your harvest. You're looking at downtime, repair costs, potentially losing crop to weather while you're getting fixed. The risk of keeping that machine is higher than the cost of upgrading." "I'll take my chances." Ron's smile faded a little. "Carl, I'm trying to help you here. Every successful farmer in this county is running newer equipment. You're the only guy I know still cutting with a combine from the Kennedy administration. There's a reason for that." "What reason's that?" "Because it's bad business. Because you're one breakdown away from disaster. Because that combine is going to cost you your farm." Carl stopped greasing, stood up, looked at Ron. "This combine's cut wheat for 16 years. My farm's been in my family for 33 years. I think I'll keep both of them." Ron shook his head. "Your call. But don't say I didn't warn you." He got back in his truck and drove away, and Carl went back to preparing his combine for harvest. 3 days later, the cutting started. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand what's at stake here. Harvest is everything to a wheat farmer. You get one shot, one window when the crop is ready and the weather cooperates. If your equipment fails during that window, you can lose thousands of dollars in a matter of days. The dealer was counting on that fear, counting on Carl believing that new equipment was the only safe bet. But Carl Metcalf understood something most farmers were forgetting. Maintenance beats replacement. Knowledge beats financing. And an old machine that you know inside and out is often more reliable than a newer machine you're still learning. If you want to hear more stories about farmers who survived by trusting what they knew instead of what they were sold, hit that subscribe button right now. The 1962 John Deere 55 wasn't the biggest combine ever made, wasn't the fastest, wasn't the most efficient by 1978 standards, but it was simple, mechanical. Everything that could break could be fixed with basic tools and common sense. Carl had rebuilt the cylinder drive twice, had replaced the rasp bars 3 times, had gone through the cleaning shoe, the straw walkers, the feeder house, the engine, every major component at one point or another. He knew that machine the way a surgeon knows anatomy. When that cylinder bearing started making noise, Carl didn't panic and he didn't call a mechanic. He ordered a new bearing from the parts supplier in town, pulled the old one on a Sunday afternoon, pressed in the new one, reassembled everything, and had the combine ready by Monday morning. Cost, $47 and 4 hours of work. The fraying canvas on the feeder house got patched with material Carl cut from an old hay elevator belt and bolted in place with hardware he already had in his shop. Cost, $0 and 90 minutes of work. The smoking engine got new rings and a valve job, work Carl did himself over 3 evenings in his machine shed, learning as he went from a service manual he'd mail-ordered from Deere. Cost, $260 in parts and about 20 hours of labor. By the time harvest started, Carl had less than $400 invested in repairs, and he had a combine he was confident would run. Ron Hartley would have charged $32,000 for confidence. Carl built his own for a fraction of that. Harvest started on Saturday, August 12th. The wheat was testing at 13.2% moisture. Perfect. The weather forecast showed clear skies for at least a week. Ideal conditions. Carl fired up the 55 at 6 in the morning. The engine coughed once, then settled into its familiar rhythm. He engaged the header, watched the reel start turning, checked all his systems. Everything worked. He dropped the header into the standing wheat and started his first pass. The combine ate the grain steadily, predictably. The cylinder threshed the kernels from the heads. The cleaning shoe separated grain from chaff. The auger moved the wheat into the hopper. Every system doing exactly what it was designed to do 16 years ago, and still doing it well enough today. By noon, Carl had cut 20 acres. By sunset, 35. He ran until the dew came up around 9 p.m., then shut down, went home, ate dinner, and slept. Sunday, he cut another 30 acres. Monday, 32. Tuesday, 28, before an afternoon thunderstorm blew through and forced him to wait for the grain to dry again. By the end of the first week, Carl had 120 acres in the bin, and the 55 hadn't missed a beat. Word got around. At the co-op, farmers talked. Heard Carl Metcalf's cutting with that old 55 again. Thought for sure that thing would be dead by now. Ron Hartley told me it was going to cost him his farm. Well, he's halfway through harvest and it's still running. Ron Hartley heard the talk, didn't like it. Drove out to Carl's place on a Thursday afternoon. Carl was in the field when Ron pulled up, watching the combine work its way down a row, dust rising behind it in the late afternoon sun. Ron got out of his truck, walked over. Looks like you're making progress. Getting there. I'll admit I'm surprised. Thought for sure you'd have broken down by now. Carl didn't take his eyes off the combine. Why? Because it's old. Because it's past its service life. Because equipment this age is unreliable. It's only unreliable if you don't maintain it. Carl, you're gambling. You got lucky this year, but what about next year, year after? That machine's living on borrowed time. Carl finally turned to look at him. Ron, I've got $400 in parts into this combine this year. You wanted me to spend $32,000 on a newer one. Even if I have to put $400 into it every single year, it'll take me 80 years to spend what you wanted me to finance. But no buts. That $7,700 you wanted to sell me, it would have cost me $680 a month. That's $8,000 a year I'd be sending to a bank instead of saving or reinvesting in my operation. For what? So I can cut my wheat 2 days faster, so I can look successful to my neighbors. Ron's jaw tightened. It's not about looking successful. It's about having reliable equipment. This is reliable. I made it reliable by learning how to fix it. The problem isn't the age of the equipment, Ron. The problem is farmers who don't know how to maintain what they have, so they keep buying new because that's easier than learning. That's not fair. Maybe not, but it's true. Ron got back in his truck without another word and left. Carl went back to watching his combine work. By the end of that day, he'd have 160 acres cut. By the end of harvest, he'd have all 300 acres in the bin, and the old 55 would be back in the machine shed, ready for another year. Let me stop here and ask you something. When was the last time someone tried to sell you a solution to a problem you could solve yourself? When was the last time fear was used to convince you to spend money you didn't have? Drop a comment, because Carl Metcalf recognized that tactic, and refusing it saved his farm. The years after 1978 followed the same pattern. Every spring, Carl would go through his combine completely, check every bearing, every belt, every chain, replace what needed replacing, adjust what needed adjusting, clean and lubricate everything that moved. Every harvest, the old 55 would start up and run, cutting wheat day after day until the job was done. And every year, Ron Hartley or one of his salesmen would stop by with a new pitch for newer equipment. 1979. Carl, I've got a 6600 that would be perfect for your operation. 5 years old, excellent condition, 24-foot header. Carl, pass. 1981. The new 7720s just came in. Rotary combines, completely different technology. You could cut faster and cleaner than anything you've seen before. Carl, not interested. 1983. Carl, that 55 is 21 years old now. You're pushing your luck. Carl, I'll take my chances. By 1985, Ron had mostly stopped trying. Carl had become the example Ron used with other farmers. Don't be like Carl Metcalf, running antique equipment and hoping it doesn't fail. But Carl's equipment never did fail, not in any way that mattered, not in any way that cost him his harvest or his farm, because Carl understood the difference between failure and wear, understood that bearings wear out and belts break and parts need replacing, and that's not failure, that's just maintenance. That's just the cost of operating machinery. Failure is when you can't afford to fix something. Failure is when your equipment payments are so high that you can't weather a bad year. Failure is when the bank forecloses because you leveraged yourself into a position where one mistake costs you everything. Carl never failed because he never put himself in a position where he could. In 1986, something interesting happened. A younger farmer named Scott Webber, who'd bought a farm 3 counties over in 1982 and financed everything, new John Deere equipment, new truck, modern facilities, went bankrupt. Scott had done everything the dealers and the bankers and the agricultural economists told him to do. He'd borrowed to expand. He'd invested in technology. He'd scaled up his operation. And when wheat prices crashed in 1985 and stayed low through 1986, Scott couldn't service his debt. The bank called his notes. Everything went to auction. His 7720 combine, 4 years old, sold for $18,000. He still owed $26,000 on it. The farmer who bought it at auction? Carl Metcalf. Carl had been running the old 55 for 24 years at that point. It still worked, but he'd been thinking about what would happen when it finally died. And here was a 4-year-old 7720 selling for $18,000, half what it would cost new. Carl paid cash for it, took it home, went through it completely, found a few things that needed attention, fixed them, and put it in his machine shed next to the 55. The next harvest, he ran both combines. The 7720 cut his big fields fast and efficient. The 55 cut the corners and the odd-shaped pieces where the bigger machine would waste time turning around. Together, they cut his harvest in half the time it used to take. And Carl didn't owe anybody a dime for either machine. Ron Hartley heard about it. Drove out to Carl's place, found him working in his shop. "Heard you bought Scott Weber's 7720. "I did." "So you finally admitted I was right. You finally admitted you needed newer equipment." Carl set down his wrench. "Ron, I bought a 4-year-old combine for $18,000 cash because it was a good value. You wanted to sell me a 3-year-old combine for $32,000 on credit 8 years ago. Those aren't the same thing. But you admitted you needed it. I didn't need it. I wanted it because the price was right and it gives me flexibility. There's a difference between need and want. You've been confusing those two things for 20 years. Carl, you're splitting hairs. No, I'm making a point. You told me in 1978 that the old 55 would cost me my farm, but I still have both. I still have the combine, and I still have the farm, and I don't owe anybody anything. Meanwhile, Scott Weber did everything you told him to do, and he lost everything." Ron didn't have an answer for that. "Here's what I need you to understand, and this is critical. The agricultural equipment industry is built on a model of continuous replacement. They need you to believe that older equipment is unreliable, that maintenance is more expensive than payments, that you can't compete without the latest technology. But Carl Metcalf proved that's a lie, not by being stubborn or cheap, but by being smart about the difference between necessary spending and fear-based spending. If you're getting value from this, share this video with someone who's facing pressure to upgrade equipment they can't afford, someone who needs to know that maintenance is an option. The 1962 John Deere 55 finally retired in 1992 after 30 years of service. Carl had owned it for 24 of those years. The frame was cracked, the cylinder was worn beyond reasonable repair, and parts were getting genuinely hard to find. Carl didn't scrap it, didn't sell it for parts. He moved it to a spot behind his barn, parked it on blocks, and let it rest. "That machine paid for itself 20 times over," he told his kids. "Least I can do is let it retire with dignity." By then, Carl was running the 7720 he'd bought at auction and a 9600 he'd picked up used in 1990, both machines paid for in cash. Both machines maintained meticulously, both machines reliable season after season. He'd cut wheat for 36 years without ever making an equipment payment, without ever owing a bank money for a combine, without ever putting his farm at risk to have newer machinery. In 1998, Carl retired from active farming at age 61. He leased his ground to a younger neighbor and spent his retirement doing custom mechanical work for farmers who needed help with older equipment. Ron Hartley had retired 2 years earlier, sold his dealership to a larger operation out of Salina. At his retirement party, someone asked him what his biggest regret was. "Carl Metcalf," Ron had said, and people thought he was joking. He wasn't. "I spent 20 years trying to convince that man he needed newer equipment. 20 years telling him his old combine would fail, and it never did. He proved everything I said was wrong, and I couldn't admit it." Someone asked, "So was Carl right?" Ron thought about it. About maintaining old equipment? Yes. About not financing unless you have to? Yes. About most farmers buying more machine than they need because they're afraid of looking unsuccessful? Absolutely yes. So why did you keep trying to sell him? Because that's what dealers do. We sell, and we convince ourselves that we're helping, that farmers need what we're selling, that debt is just a tool. But the truth is, guys like Carl don't need us. They never did. Carl Metcalf is 87 years old now, still lives on the same farm his father bought in 1945, still walks out to the barn every morning and looks at the old equipment that served him so well for so many years. The 1962 John Deere 55 is still sitting behind the barn, weathered and faded, but still recognizable. His grandchildren climb on it sometimes, and Carl tells them the story about the dealer who said it would cost him his farm, about the 20 years he ran it after that warning, about the hundreds of thousands of dollars he saved by maintaining instead of replacing. "Did it ever break down?" his grandson asked once. "Sure, bearings wore out, belts broke, parts needed replacing, but that's not breaking down. That's just machines being machines. Real breakdown is when you can't afford to fix something, when your payments are so high that one bad year ruins you. I never broke down like that. Because you kept the old combine? Because I didn't go into debt for a new one. There's a difference." The lesson Carl Metcalf taught isn't complicated. It's not some secret wisdom or hidden knowledge. It's simple arithmetic and basic priorities. Maintenance costs less than payments. Knowledge weighs less than debt. An old machine you understand is safer than a new machine that owns you. The John Deere dealer said that old combine would cost Carl his farm. 20 years later, Carl still had both. The combine finally retired at 30 years old. The farm is still in the family after 79 years. And the farmers who took the dealer's advice, most of them are gone, foreclosed, sold out, moved on to other lives because they believed the lie that you have to spend money to make money. Carl Metcalf proved you just have to be smarter than the people trying to take your money. If this story changed how you think about equipment and debt and maintaining what you have instead of buying what you don't need, do me 3 favors. First, subscribe to this channel for more stories about farmers who survived by thinking different. Second, drop a comment telling me, what old equipment are you still running that everyone says you should replace? Third, share this with someone who's being pressured to finance equipment they can't afford. And remember, the dealer told Carl that old combine would cost him his farm, but the only thing that old combine cost him was $400 a year in maintenance. Meanwhile, the farmers who bought new equipment lost everything. Choose maintenance over payments. Choose knowledge over fear. Choose keeping your farm over looking successful. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.